50 years ago this past May, I was ordained a deacon, and I asked my Archbishop at that time if I would be able to do missionary work in Africa. And gratefully, he let me do that. And so I spent the summer in Zambia, a beautiful country. And since there were few priests, the deacon who was part of the community, namely myself, was in charge of the Sunday communion services because there were enough priests to have Mass. And so I presided over these communion services, and the first time I did that, I was present with the large community of people. We had the first reading and the second reading, and then time for the gospel with the Alleluia. And I was looking for the gospel book, but then all of a sudden, a woman in the congregation came forward with it. She was brightly dressed with a wonderful dress and headdress, and as people were singing the Alleluia, she brought forth the book, and then there were four men who had this big chair, and they held the four legs of the chair, and the book was placed on that chair and brought forward to me. And as that was happening, I turned to the catechist and I said, "What does this mean?" He said, "Well, this is how we welcome an important guest in our midst. We are going to hear in the gospel," he said, "the words of Jesus. And so when it comes time for you to give the homily, you have to preach in a way that the people hear Jesus. You have to preach in a way that makes Jesus present to them." I thought, what a tall order that was. Today we have in the gospel the disciples sent out 2 by 2 and being charged with being the voice of Christ in the world, to speak as Jesus does. And what is it that we hear? We first of all hear throughout the Gospels that Jesus is the one who proclaims good news. The good news being that, in fact, each one of us are valued by God. He knows the number of hairs on our head. He loves us individually. Or as a Dominican friend of mine says, the good news is that God loves you as an individual, and the bad news is he loves everybody else, and we have to deal with that. But Jesus also preaches in such a way that drives out demons. Those fears in our life that hold us back, those emotions that paralyze us, whether that be greed or lust or envy, backbiting, we have to preach in such a way that helps people be free of those kinds of emotions. And finally, we see that Jesus preaches and he gives his disciples power to preach in a way that brings healing. There is so much woundedness in our world today, not just in people who are elderly, who are suffering physical infirmities, but young people as well, who sometimes have a sense of hopelessness about their lives, who are wounded because of family breakups or maybe disappointments that life is not going the way they wanted. And so we have to preach in such a way that brings healing to them. Yes, it is a demand on the one who presides at the liturgy to talk in a way and speak in a way that people recognize the voice of Jesus. That's a tall order that all of us should take seriously. But it's also something that all of us who come to the Mass, come to the Eucharist, should keep in mind. Can we leave here with the ability to go into the world so that people hear the voice of Jesus when we speak in a way that is good news, lets them know that God loves them, but also casting out all fears in their life, those kinds of fears that many times hold people back, rather than being harsh with them, speaking in a way that liberates them. And finally, speaking in a way that does not bring more woundedness in our world by backbiting and rumor and gossip, but rather speaking to a world that needs to be healed by the words of Jesus. Yes, that is what we're called to do. You know, the very name Mass means mission. It is us who are being sent out into the world. And hopefully, whenever we celebrate the Eucharist, we're going to be able to hear the voice of Jesus speak to us, so that we can grab a hold of that voice and use it as we go into the world, so that as that catechist told me, when we speak, others will hear the voice of Jesus.